Hey everyone, I'm going to be doing some little videos to support your reading of Adam Smith. I think you'll love the Adam Smith. I've not given you a huge amount, right? So you can really kind of dwell on it, reread it. These videos won't be very long, maybe 8 minutes, something like that. So the first thing we want to do is I just want to give you some basic ideas about Smith, and then the first chapter that I gave you to read, and then the next video will be the other two chapters for this week's work, right? So the thing about Smith is he's quite unusual as an ethical thinker. You might think that there are like loads of different ethical theories out there, right? But actually there are very few, basically a handful of ethical theories, and Smith's is one of them. And he's unusual in that he puts the weight of ethics on emotion. Almost all the other theories rely heavily upon thinking about the kind of the role of reason and the human as living up to a rational ideal. But Smith argues that you and I are moral to the degree that our emotions are in alignment. And this is very important. So on the one hand, you and I think, feel quite comfortable around being emotional, right? We kind of almost prioritize it maybe. But Smith thinks this is the root of moral judgment. So the important thing about Smith is that when you've got the emotions in play, then moral judgment is in play. And the idea hinges upon this spectator concept. Now, I think, even though he wrote this a couple of hundred years ago, I actually think we today get it even better than maybe people back then did, right? Because you in particular, you're very online people, right? With social media, you strongly have the sense that you're being observed, that people are watching you, and more critically, right, people are judging you. And of course, today with influencers, right, there are people who are making a great deal of money in many different social media venues by being watched and getting lots of likes for what they do, right? This has now become a kind of a fundamental strategy for the way that companies pick up on influencers who are often regular folk and pick them up off the street, right? And then they kind of embed them in the way that they sell their products. Okay, we all know this, right? You know this more than I do. So the idea that we're being watched, that there's a witness to what we do. This, of course, is a very ancient idea. It goes right back to the Bible, right? Think about one of the commandments, right, that says, do not bear false witness. And in fact, actually, I think probably you and I, if we sat around and thought like, well, what's one of the very worst things a human being can do? Well, it's to bear false witness, right? It's to get someone into trouble when in fact they're innocent of it. So Smith is fascinated. The whole book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, I'll just show, this is the book, right, if you wanted to purchase it, right, but you're looking at the online version. But it's a wonderful book, and if you want to build out your personal library, this is a great book to begin with, right? So, but the whole book is about, okay, how do we think about the emotions, and how do we think about the spectator? Like, how many spectators are there? What happens if they don't agree? Which spectator do you have to pay attention to, right? You know this, right? You know this. Think about when there's a divergence between your friends as your spectator who want you to do stuff, and like maybe your parents or your grandparents or maybe your college professors, right? So wait, like, how do these spectators, how do they cohere, right? What happens when they diverge, right? Since moral judgment is in the power of the spectator. This is very important. So ultimately, right, what Smith, and this is for a much later video, right, but what Smith is ultimately going to try and arrive at is whether there's something called an impartial spectator, right? A spectator that's not in any way partisan. It's not linked to an ethnos or, a people or something like that, right? So, but we'll get there. All right. So here's the sort of, my dog came to say, well, one of my dogs came to say hello. Sit down, Molly. So here's a really interesting thing. So to be moral your emotions have to be symmetrical with the emotion of the spectator who's watching. Right? So you've got the person principally concerned. That's maybe you or me exhibiting, joy or grief or anger, or right, and we're being watched, right? So there's got to be a symmetry, and that symmetry Smith calls sympathy. Now, it's not that the spectator necessarily has your emotion, right? Now that can happen. It can absolutely happen that you're angry about something and the spectator is angry with you. The spectator is like, yeah, I understand your anger. That's outrageous. Or the spectator sees your joy and is absolutely filled with joy for you as well. But oftentimes that's not what happens at all, right? And Smith, in fact, in the first chapter, he gives this example, right? He says, you could see someone pass you by in the street and you could tell from their face that they were in real grief. And he says, but, you might be completely obsessed by, I don't know, maybe you just bought a new beautiful item, or you're pondering a mathematical problem, or, you're just in a bad mood yourself and you're kind of self-obsessed or self-absorbed and you just have no bandwidth to give that person. But he says, and this is very important for the assignments, right? He says, but in principle, even though you have no emotion for the person, when you learn what it is about, you can then picture it out in your mind. And he thinks you and I are really good at this, right? So we see someone's face in grief and they walk by us and we're preoccupied. But we think, oh, well, it's probably, they may have had really bad news, about a loved one or something like that. And basically what we're doing in our imagination is sort of picturing out, and I really want to stress that. He says that, remember, when you read it, you'll see those words, right? You picture out. You picture out the sort of the causes of grief, and you're like, oh, okay. Now, you're making a guess, right, that's what the root of it is, right? I mean, if somebody was really grieving and you discovered that it was, I don't know, they got served a bad meal in a restaurant or something like that, right? But they were really showing evidence of grief, right? You'd be like, dude, get a life, wake up, right? I mean, that's just not appropriate, right? It's to the point, right? It's out of proportion. So when you do your assignments, think about your companies. How do they foster this picturing out, right? So all companies now have social media, right? They're constantly playing with sort of trying to facilitate the way that you picture out yourself with the product. And this is also very important because another innovation of Smith's is that if you read the first chapter I assigned, you'll notice something rather odd. He blends the good and the beautiful. So he'll talk about the something being decent and graceful, or improper and ungraceful. So this weird blending of the good and the beautiful is really basic to Smith's thinking. And the reason is that he thinks that the fundamental driver of the economy, it's not money, it's vanity. It's the celebration of beauty. And you might be like, whoa, wait, right? But just think about it for a little bit, right? This actually has a lot of legs to it, right? So think about iPhones, right? I think Loyola is a Apple campus, right? And the one thing you'd want to say about Apple products is that they're beautiful, right? They're sort of stylish. And Apple has thought really, really hard about that phenomenon. So you want to think about, in terms of your companies, you want to think about how do they project, or how do they make you picture out the glamour of the company? And by glamour, I don't just mean the supermodel Hermes, Louis Vuitton, although some of you might do the Hermes, right? In which case, yeah, we are talking glamour, right? But if you're doing like one of the sports franchises, right, then right, well, of course, yeah, this is really interesting, right? Because of course, professional athletes, we do tend to glamorize them, right? And some of you might do the Taylor Swift thing, right? And you think of only Kelsey, right? I mean, he's a highly glamorized personage, right? So the Chiefs, there's a reason, right? The Chiefs drill down on the Travis and Taylor phenomenon, right? So that's all Smith, right? Smith's like, yeah, of course, right? So this is what's really cool and interesting about him. Now, of course, some of you know, right? He's the founder of, or he's the man who first provided the deepest systematic presentation of economic theory, right? So, this is a guy who really kind of set the agenda for the world that you and I live in, right? Which is a kind of a commercial civilization. So, this first video, I'm going to stop it now. I wanted to pull out a few phrases from the first chapter. I wanted to, maybe for those of you who have started the reading, I wanted to confirm what you're reading. You may be like, wait, is this guy like all about the emotions and how the emotions are synchronized and right? And so the thing that he dwells on at the end of the chapter, right, is if someone is out of proportion, if someone has exaggerated emotions, right? Because then when you picture out what it was that kind of generated that emotion, you're like, I don't get that, right? So think about, I don't know if young people still use this phrase, right? But if someone is extra, right? So if you have a friend, who is extra, right? Well, it's a criticism, right? It might be a loving criticism, right? But the point would be that they do tend to overly exaggerate their emotions given the circumstances, right? So the main thing is to dwell on that sympathy that he talks about all the time, right, is about the synchronization of a person's emotion with the spectator who's looking, right? And those spectators, they're sometimes literally concrete people, right? And you know that from social media. But as we get deeper into the book, and we're all going to read a few chapters, but I selected the chapters so that you get a little bit of a grip on this, right? The spectator is maybe a bit stranger, at least sometimes, than just like regular folk that you meet. But that's very real. It's very real, right? The regular folk that you meet are judging you, right? Because that's the nature of spectators, okay? All right. So hope that was helpful for you, and I hope you have a good start. All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.